Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Jules, the iCAAD speaker liaison. It's my greatest pleasure to introduce Dr. Jon Goldin. Dr. Jon Goldin is a renowned consultant in child and adolescent psychiatry at Great Ormond Street Hospital and an honorary senior lecturer at the Institute of Child Health. He has been head of service on the Mildred Creek unit for the past 15 years and is lead psychiatrist in the Department of Child and Adolescent Mental Health. Dr. Goldin is Joint Training Programme Director for the Great Ormond Street Royal London Higher Training Scheme in Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. He is also elected Vice Chair of the Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Faculty, Executive at the Royal College of Psychiatrists and the Co-Chair of the Westminster Parliamentary Committee. Today's presentation is entitled Working with the Media to Promote Child Mental Health. Dr. Goldin will discuss his experience of working with the media, illustrate this with examples, and offer advice and guidance for those who might undertake this kind of work. So without further ado, it's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be able to talk here today, and thank you for coming to the talk. I'm imagining that you're a sort of mixture of clinicians and maybe non-clinicians, would that be fair to say? Yeah? So I hope this talk is kind of interesting for all of you. Obviously I'm coming from quite a clinical perspective, and part of my motivation for doing the media work that I've been doing the last few years is very much to try and improve clinical services for CAMs across the country, which, as people will probably know, does anyone work in CAMs in the audience? Some of you do? Yeah. As people will know, services are extremely stretched in this country, but also across the UK and across the world, really. I was just very briefly meeting you. You said you're from Bali? Bahrain. Child psychiatrist from Bali. Is that right? Bahrain, sorry. I thought you said Bali. Okay. Bahrain. Okay. So, I'm sure that CAM services are pretty stretched across the world, actually, because I know that the resources are limited. But one of the things I want to try and do is help contribute to improving CAM services across the UK. And part of that is through lobbying politicians, influencing the public debate. And what I'll be talking about today is how one does that. Talk in the media and so on, and try and, as I say, influence the debate. So let's just see where we are. So why do it? That's the first question. I've already started to answer that. One wants to try and really get a particular message across. I think one wants to get the kind of messages across about, 50% of mental health problems start by the age of 14, and about 75% start by the age of 18 or 19. So if you invest early, then you're going to prevent problems in the longer term. And I think as a country we don't invest in our children's services adequately. Partly you might argue somewhat cynically that children don't get the vote. That might be a factor, that politicians don't think children are going to protest, but actually we're seeing a bit of a movement in the last year or so of children protesting more and coming out on the streets about climate change and about a range of things. So I think that's great that young people are, finding their voice more clearly. They need to in the current political climate, global political climate. I and others want to support them to get their message across about the importance of working with children. There was something that came out just yesterday about knife crime. Some of you will have seen it. That there was a study that showed a direct correlation between the closure of youth centres and an increase in knife crime. So I saw that. I'm going to talk a little bit about Twitter later, but I saw that on Twitter. That's where one can get quite a lot of useful information from, up-to-date information. And Westminster, I think we're in Westminster now, might be anyway, we're very near Westminster, if we're not actually in Westminster. They reduced their youth centres by 91% apparently over the last few years, and of course their knife crime has gone up very significantly. So I think there is a correlation there, if not a cause. So I'm going to talk about what kind of messages we want to get across. That would be the kind of message that I would want to get across, that we shouldn't be closing our youth centres. Preparation for interviews, thinking about interviews themselves. I'll talk a little bit about social media. I actually talked at this conference last year about social media more generally and the links between social media and the mental health of teenagers. I'm not going to obviously repeat that message, but and the message is sort of a mixed one, that it has risks and benefits. But I am going to talk just a little bit about Twitter, if we've got time, and how it can be used usefully, and then we'll conclude. So first of all, why do it? I've touched on it already, but it's a big opportunity to sort of demystify, educate, reduce stigma. Mental health conditions have a big stigma, and I think if you talk about them openly in the media, that is a very positive thing. that's happening more and more. You'll know about the Heads Together campaign from, I think it started in about 2016. The royals were involved in that. I saw a couple of weeks ago that Prince Harry is doing something with Oprah Winfrey. They're doing a series on mental health conditions for Apple TV, so this is kind of, state-of-the-art stuff being broadcast online, and that's, I think, going to be quite a major series, so that will be interesting to see what happens there. But people are talking more openly about mental health conditions, and they're talking more openly about their own difficulties, and I think that, that is a kind of positive thing, celebrities and sports people and so on. We want to make information about mental health accessible. So, if you read, well, there were some awful headlines, several years ago. I think it's changing a bit, but one that just comes to mind is, when Frank Bruno was sectioned, that bonkers Bruno on the front page of The Sun and these kind of things. Very unhelpful, very stigmatizing. And actually, I heard Frank Bruno interviewed recently, and he was, so articulate about his mental health condition. He has bipolar disorder, and his experiences of being treated and being a lot better now, actually, with the right kind of treatment. And so we want to make educate and make these issues more accessible to the wider public, so that there's less kind of stigma, hopefully. Increase engagement in mental health issues, raise the profile. One of the big aims we've had recently at the Royal College of Psychiatrists is there's a hashtag Choose Psychiatry, and the aim of it is to encourage recruitment into psychiatry, because there's a shortage of psychiatrists nationally. And so the kind of message that we want to get across is that psychiatry is an interesting specialty, it's rewarding, it's diverse. We want to encourage medical students and junior doctors to go into it, and we also want to encourage recruitment, so people closer to my age in the second half of their career don't leave prematurely. So that's another message we try and get across. Influencing public debates, lobbying for change, obviously, advocating for our patients and colleagues. I was interviewed on a PM programme when Eddie Mair was doing it a couple of years ago, and the interview was around a suicide that happened on an adolescent ward at the Maudsley. So I don't work at the Maudsley, so it was easier for me to talk about it, but I did know the colleagues involved and so on. And I felt like I was kind of advocating for them in some way, saying that there's an inherent risk in working with highly suicidal teenagers. I didn't quite use the phrase there, but for the grace of God go I. But I was thinking that to some extent. We should not be vilifying the staff about this. And I think some coroner had said that a lot of mental health staff are burnt out. So that was the premise of the kind of questioning: are all you guys burnt out? And should you still be doing your job? And I said, well, there might be a very small minority of people who are burnt out, and it is a very stressful job. But by and large, I tried to convey a sort of positive message that people are working very hard and are very motivated and are not burnt out. So one needs to sort of balance your messages, and that was one example of it, hopefully, and as I say, advocating for colleagues in that particular situation as well as patients. Promoting psychiatry as a medical specialty, I've spoken about that a bit. Informing and providing accurate information. There's a lot of myths out there about mental health, and the media can help that, or they cannot help that sometimes. Several years ago, I was asked by an Evening Standard journalist about who was the youngest patient I treated with anorexia. And I said, I once treated a 7-year-old girl, but that's extremely unusual. And literally 2 or 3 hours later, I was walking past the newsagent, and the front page of the Evening Standard said, "Diet danger in 7-year-olds," and then I was quoted as, slightly misquoted, actually. So our press office, who had been involved in setting up this phone interview, as it was, complained about this, and they said, you're sensationalizing it, you're taking the quote out of context, you're not telling the whole story. They moved it to sort of page 8 or something and changed the headline by the time of the next edition. But this is just an example of how quickly the media can move, and how careful you have to be. And even if you are careful, it's never absolutely foolproof. But unfortunately, that journalist wanted to sensationalize a message. Other times, you do get to know journalists, ones that are more likely to or less likely to sort of give a balanced view of what you're saying. But you're not going to work with people again if they're going to, do what that guy did. And the press office at the Royal College will be, would have picked that up with, in that case, the Evening Standard. It's rewarding. It's, I've been a consultant for about 17 years now, and I probably spend about 5% of my working life doing this kind of media stuff. And I have to say it's 5% of my life that I enjoy, working life that I enjoy, and it's a change, and it's it helps one sort of diversify one's interest in it, and it feels like it's worthwhile. As I say, it is a bit of a risk. Exposure can be, wanted or unwanted. You need to be careful about making personal disclosures. I've got 2 teenage daughters, and I'm very aware of some of the challenges that parents might have around social media and smartphones and all this kind of thing. And occasionally I'm a little bit tempted to say, when I was talking to my 14-year-old daughter last night, or arguing with her about something to do with phones, but actually that's not particularly helpful, I don't think. One needs to be a little bit careful about that kind of thing. We're a small audience, I'm sure you won't print that, as it were, but I think you need to be a bit careful about personal disclosures. But I think if you have had personal experience of what you're talking about, that can certainly help in your sort of authenticity, perhaps. Making errors, of course we're all human, of course we all make errors. I saw, some of you might have seen Nicholas Witchell on the BBC News earlier this week talking about the new royal baby, and he went blank live on BBC News, which I've never seen a journalist, such an experienced journalist as him, do that. Actually, it was kind of unusual, but it did remind you that even these senior experienced journalists can just kind of have thought block. And he actually said, "Forgive me," and then he looked at his notes, and then he said, "I'm sorry, back to the studio." I don't know if anyone saw it, but it was just interesting, and it kind of, in a way, reassured me, because one always has to forgive oneself if one stumbles or makes a mistake, and it's tempting to say to yourself, it's got to be 100% perfect, there are millions of people listening, but we're all human, and you do your best, basically. One of my former trainers said to me, it's a bit like a Grand Slam tennis match. If you're being interviewed by John Humphrey on the Today programme, there's a certain sort of backwards and forwards, but you are under the spotlight, and I might, if we've got time, I might play an interview later about that. But that can feel a little bit like that. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. Obviously, there's that fear of saying something stupid. Some psychiatrists will have more inclination to do this kind of thing than others. Some of my colleagues say, I wouldn't do that in a million years. Others are very good at it. Expertise, experience. And I think, if someone doesn't do it, if we don't do it, who will? And I think it's important to try and get these messages out there. You also need to think about who you're speaking on behalf of. So how much is it a personal view? How much are you making a trust statement on behalf of your trust? How much are you talking on behalf of the Royal College? These are the kind of things that you need to try and be clear about in your own mind. And trust where I work, Great Ormond Street, is very sensitive about its, well, most trusts are, NHS trusts, but very sensitive about its public image. Obviously, we get a lot of money through charity donations. There's a big corporate aspect to the hospital. And they have, over the years, said to me, make it really clear you're talking on behalf of the Royal College. Don't mention Great Ormond Street. Partly because they want their public profile to be around, babies who are having heart-lung transplants, or patients, children who are bald because they've had chemotherapy who are then recovering. This is the kind of public image that they want to portray. They don't so much want to have their consultants talking about sexual abuse in the media, as I was, several years ago on the Today programme and things like that. So, and actually that's changed. We've got a new head of comms, and I've been, saying, well, I think we're just perpetuating the stigma, by acting like we don't have psychiatrists at Great Ormond Street, and mental health is not something we can talk about. And that really is changing. And Mental Health Awareness Week is coming up. I think it's next week. And the front of Great Ormond Street is going to be lit up in green, which is going to be the colour for mental health awareness. So they're trying a little bit, and I think and we'll put that out on social media and try and sort of link the two together, the mind and the body, as it were. You do need to link in with the media office, so you don't want to go out on a limb, and people will sometimes contact you directly, journalists, and you need to make sure that they have liaised with your media office, because if you do say something that your trust or the college don't want you to say, you're putting yourself out there a little bit on a limb. Some people do that, but it's not very wise. And so try and be on message, and obviously you want to agree with the message. If you don't agree with the message, you probably shouldn't be doing the interview. And so, as I say, be cautious about being contacted directly by journalists. That does happen sometimes. And sometimes journalists just contact you and say, are there any stories coming up? They're looking for a story, and that's an opportunity to influence what will get out there. So this is a bit about my radio and print experience. The first interview I did was about 6 years ago probably. That was a radio car with Evan Davis. I couldn't get to the studio in time. I couldn't get to the studio that day, but they sent a radio car which I always wondered what a radio car is. Sort of, I imagined a big car and you sit on the back seats and you've got a microphone or something. But it's basically a mobile studio. I don't know if anyone's seen it. It's got a huge mast at the top, and you sort of sit there in this little cubby hole kind of thing. And then you've got headphones on. There's a technician there, so it's quite an interesting experience. But that was I won't forget that. It was one of the first times I was interviewed on Radio 4, and that was about deliberate self-harm. Another one from about 3 years ago was sexual abuse. If we've got time, as I say, I'll play that a little bit. Sarah Montague, when she interviewed me about CAMS funding, one of the things I remember about that interview was I tried to make eye contact with her just before. I was sitting across a table with her, and she kind of looked at me momentarily and blanked me. No kind of rapport established or anything like that. And I think she blanked me because she had someone talking to her in her ears, and she was probably spinning about 10 plates that I wasn't aware of. She was about to interview me. But, you sort of, and I momentarily felt a bit, I wanted to, as a psychiatrist, one always tries to establish a bit of rapport with someone you're trying to speak to. And I think that's important wherever possible. And it felt like a bit of a shame about just before, as I was going to go live in front of millions of people, that she had no flicker of kind of, body language or communication, like we're about to talk to each other. But you have to manage, and I was obviously anxious as well, you have to manage your own anxiety as well. No one else is going to sort of manage it for you. Martha Carney was lovely on Radio 4. She came and spoke to me before the programme. This was the World at One, so midday, so no one's quite as bleary-eyed, everyone's a bit more awake, and it's a bit less pressurised than the Today programme, and you do have time to have a conversation beforehand. And I said to her that I thought it was a national scandal, the funding of CAMS. This was out beforehand, and she said, make sure you say that on air, and they want you to say that kind of thing, and you have to be a little bit careful if they try and push you in a direction of saying something more exaggerated than you want to say. But I did say that, and I did think it was a national scandal, and I was okay about saying that. But I've been in situations where Jeremy Hunt has been down the line, and I've been talking about CAMS in the studio, and he has not wanted to debate with me. I mean, that happened a few years ago, or hasn't wanted to debate with a clinician directly. He wants the clinician to be interviewed, and then he wanted to have the final interview just with the interviewer, so he could make his points, and then that would be the end. So someone once, I was interviewed with, this is a separate occasion, it's on YouTube if people want to look at it, but we were talking about the CAMS Green Paper, and Jeremy Hunt was there, I was there, Peter Fonagy was there, and Peter Fonagy and I were talking beforehand about how we were going to play it, and he said to me, a politician will never forgive you if you publicly humiliate them. So you have to kind of find a balance between, saying you promised that 3 years ago and nothing has happened, and you're doing that live, and that, they might never appear with you again or remember you as a troublemaker. But at the same time, you have to try and be authentic and honest and direct about what you think. So that's a kind of balance. And some friends of mine, colleagues, said, you look really grumpy on that interview, appropriately grumpy, because I was sitting next to Jeremy Hunt, who I felt was sort of saying things that were a little bit, spin and not backed up by his actions. So anyway, there's a balance there that one needs to strike. Nick Ferrari's a bit of a character. That was on LBC. I like talking to him. He's quite direct and interesting. You and Yours on Radio 4. You'd think that would be a nice, friendly one. Actually, I can't remember what the interviewer's name was, but it was one of the toughest ones. And also, I had to negotiate the receptionist. There was some studio sort of at the side of the main BBC building, and they weren't expecting me. They didn't know who I was. You would think these kind of things would be organised. I was like, I'm supposed to be live on air in 5 minutes. Who are you? Just need to check my system. And I knew I had to be on at 5 to 1 because the programme ended at 1. If I wasn't there, the interview wouldn't happen. So you have to negotiate sometimes these systemic issues as well. But she was very challenging about funding and disagree. She gave the government line that funding had increased over the last 5 years, etc., etc. So I had to debate that. Print journalism, quite a few things in print journalism and online as well. This is some stuff about TV experience. If we've got time, I will show some clips. The Victoria Derbyshire programme is a lovely programme. Probably some of you watch it, or probably most of you are working when it's on, but you can catch up with it when it's, often they have mental health issues that they're debating. They often have service users on that, and I think Victoria Derbyshire is an impressive journalist and certainly interested in these issues. The various news programmes, Channel 4, we did one on lack of beds, travelling long distances. The Right Stuff was an interesting one. It's no longer The Right Stuff. I think it's Jeremy Vine now does it, doesn't he, on Channel 5. But The Right Stuff was an interesting one because that was a panel with Matthew Wright, and then I was sitting in the audience as a sort of invited expert, and one of my trainees was sitting next to me, so she thought that was a good day at the office. And we had an interesting crowd of people around us. Who, members of the public, some of whom are always in the audience apparently on that programme. And we also had a live phone-in, so that was interesting to sort of answer questions directly from parents of teenagers who had mental health problems. And they did say that they would screen the calls a little bit, so I wouldn't get someone who was just, wanting to just completely have a go at psychiatrists, and there's plenty of people out there who might want to do that for various reasons. So it was actually a fairly friendly programme, but again there's risks involved in doing live phone-ins on TV, but it was a good experience. It was worth doing. There's been stuff about cannabis treating medical conditions recently, transition. I could just give you a quick clip about transition. I can see if I can work this thing as well. Not that one, let's see where it is. This one, it's just a very short one, but it just gives you an idea of the kind of thing. This is Luciana Berger. How does it go on the screen? It's on here, but it's not on there.
I forgot about doing this.
Yeah, that's not the one. Yeah, that's the one, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah. What did you...
Young
people
tell us sometimes at the age of 18 that it's like falling off a cliff edge in terms of services. They get good holistic services from CAMS
Sorry, what did you say I should do?
Double click it and it'll go big.
teams.
Should we go back to the beginning? It's only about 30 seconds long, this, I think.
Young people tell us sometimes at the age of 18 that it's like falling off a cliff edge in terms of services. They get good holistic services from CAMS teams, child and adolescent mental health services, but then when they reach the age of 18 they need to be transferred to adult services, and they feel that their needs aren't met in the same way.
The government rejects the criticisms and says its strategy, backed by extra staff and more money, will transform mental health services for young people. Alison Holt, BBC News.
Okay. So how do I get rid of that now? I've lost the...
If we go back to your...
Let's go back to the presentation. It just gives you an idea of, that was a much longer interview, but they just took, they take a little section of it. Thank you. Sorry, just bear with me. I'm not seeing the... yeah.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us on Breakfast. The government should issue guidance telling parents not to give smartphones to those children under 11 years old as a way perhaps to avoid depression and anxiety. This is according to a leading Royal College psychiatrist.
It's a debate in households across the country, isn't it? When does your child get their first phone? What kind of phone? This warning comes after yesterday's Ofcom report, which we covered, which said that people in the UK now check their phones on average every 12 minutes, and lots of us probably a bit more often than that. Let's speak to Dr Jon Goldin from the Royal College of Psychiatrists, who joins us now from our London newsroom. Good morning to you. Thank you for coming on Breakfast. So what do you say? Don't give a smartphone to children under 11. Why not?
Well, this is guidance. This is a suggestion that the Royal College of Psychiatrists has come up with. We're not saying that it's absolutely essential that no children under 11 should have smartphones, but we do think that that's a reasonable cut-off and a reasonable recommendation for parents today. If you look at the social media apps such as Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, the age recommendations are for above 13-year-olds, so there's no particular reason for a junior school child to have a smartphone.
Apart from the fact that they will say, well, all my mates have got smartphones, and that's the way we function now in our class, in our year at school. It's the new normal.
They would say that, and lots of 9-10-year-olds say that all their friends have smartphones and they tell their parents that, but I think when the parents actually talk to each other, they find that that's not necessarily the case. I mean, we want our young people to be interacting face to face, to be getting out, playing outside and so on. And there's quite a lot of risks associated with social media at the age of 9 and 10. As we know, there's sort of the sense of fear of missing out and feeling that you're somewhat addicted to your phone. We know from the Ofcom report that adults look at their phones every 12 minutes on average. And we need to set a good example for our children. We want our children to be doing other things other than just looking at their phones and social media, particularly in junior school.
The thing is, they do lots of things, don't they? I mean, kids today seem to do more than we ever did when we were children, but they've also got their phones as well. It's just part of modern life, and if they haven't got a phone themselves, they're on their parents' phones, aren't they? It's just, there's no getting away from it, surely.
Well, there is, in some sense, there is no getting away from it. We're suggesting this guidance for junior school children. In some countries, such as Ireland and France, they're making suggestions that social media should not be available for children under the age of 16, and we think that is probably going too far. You can't really put the genie back in the bottle, but we do think that parents are crying out for recommendations in this area, and we think that a reasonable cut-off to suggest is that junior school children don't have access to smartphones or don't have their own smartphone. They can use their parents sometimes, and obviously it's a decision that parents have to make for themselves, but this we think is a reasonable broad guidance.
We were talking earlier this morning about a separate debate about bringing up kids and whether children do enough and take enough risks and have enough time on their own these days, just exploring. I suppose one of the reasons parents don't let their children go out is because they can't contact them. Maybe a phone allows that sort of contact of communication, which actually then gives kids more freedom and more opportunities.
Yeah, I think that's quite a reasonable argument that children aged 10 might need a phone, but they don't necessarily need a smartphone with access to the internet and all sorts of social media. I think you can get basic phones where you can text or contact your parents and be contactable without needing access to Instagram, Facebook, etc., which in my view are not particularly appropriate for 9 or 10-year-olds.
Okay, Dr Jon Goldin, thank you very much indeed. Let us know what you think of that in the usual way this morning. We'll maybe read out some of your comments.
If we go back to the... yeah. Thank you. So it just gives you an idea of a couple of things. By the way, when you're sort of down the line, you're in a sort of room where you're looking at basically a black screen. So it's much easier to be interviewed by someone in front of you rather than just sort of staring at a black screen with a lens in it. So I always admire people who manage to sort of establish rapport with basically what is a black screen. You can't see the interviewer. Okay, so there's a few other things that I've done there that you can see. I've got a clip about Panorama because that was probably one of the scariest things I've done, because Panorama has a reputation for sort of making clinicians look bad and editing it in a particular way, and they've got a particular view that they want to put across. So I'll show that later if we've got time. But that interview was quite an interesting one. They did a program called Kids in Crisis, which was quite hard hitting actually, and some people argue that it put CAMHS in a bad light because they showed the absolute worst kind of cases and how families were really struggling to access help. But I think it was a fairly accurate reflection of what can go on out there. So in terms of getting the message across, you need to sort of know your audience. You need to be thinking about what is your message, and you need to also watch your language, what kind of language you're using, and I'll come on to say a bit more about that in a little while. So in terms of your audience, have some idea of what the rough age is. I've done some stuff for things like Newsround or teenage magazines. Obviously the way you answer questions or word things might be different for a teenager as opposed to sort of your average Radio 4 Today programme listener. So have an idea of who's listening or who's watching, what their knowledge is, what's their interest, what's their opinion or bias. If you talk to a reporter from the Daily Mail, you have some idea of what kind of readership they're going to have and how they might spin what you say. So you need to be kind of aware of that sort of thing, and you want to, in a way, sort of try and think about taking your audience on a journey. So where are they now, and where do you want them to be? So hopefully if you think about this particular talk, I would hope that by the end of the talk you'll have a bit more idea about what it's like to talk to the media, what it's like to be involved in interviews on TV and radio, some of the pitfalls that could occur, some of the pleasures and rewards of doing it and the advantages of doing it. And so you'll have a sort of clear idea hopefully at the end of the talk than you did at the beginning of some of those issues. So you want to take your audience on a bit of a journey. That applies to making a presentation, compiling an information leaflet. So why are people there? Why are they reading or listening, and what do they know already? You also need to know something about the media that you're involved with. So popular media really is not there as such to provide a free information service. We want to use them as a kind of conduit to get our message across. But really they want to inform, but they want to entertain, they want to boost their readership or listenership or viewers. They might want to present particular views. We know our press is pretty biased, I think it's fair to say. Our national press, very influenced by the owners and so on. And so particular views are being put across. So you want to try and influence the national debate, hopefully in a positive way. They want to make a profit, so that's probably why the Evening Standard did what they did, a few years ago, because they wanted people to see the headline and buy the paper. It's free now. I think you had to pay for it back then. And they want to also justify public investment. So the BBC are very affected by that. I think sometimes one could argue that they are, don't challenge people enough around, their views around Brexit and things like that. And I think they're a little bit scared of the government and retribution because they are, a public broadcaster and they could have the licence fee cut. So, papers, magazines, online publications and so on have different editorial lines, different styles. Newsnight is quite hard-hitting. Women's Own has a different perspective, obviously focused on women. Daily Mail, I think I've mentioned it a couple of times already. Some people call it the Daily Whale. But yeah, they have different kind of political approaches and stances. Think about what content is usually featured. I think the other thing to say about journalism is that they want to get an interesting story. So I used to get asked a lot at the time of London Fashion Week about size 0 models and are they causing anorexia? And I said, no, they're not causing anorexia. Anorexia is caused by different factors. It's caused by genetic factors, it's caused by family factors. There are socio-cultural factors that definitely contribute to anorexia, and size 0 models might be part of that. But I gave a kind of more nuanced answer than they wanted. What they would have liked to say is size 0 models, psychiatrist says they are causing an increase in anorexia in young people, and then it's nice and black and white. I didn't really think that the research backed that up at all. So they stopped asking me after a while because I wasn't kind of dramatic enough about that. So they want to get an interesting story, and you want to, as a clinician talking about something, want to give a fair and balanced perspective. Controversy, conflict, heroes and villains, winners and losers, these kind of things make a story. Trends and changes, what's new, unusual or different. So stories are either kind of newsworthy or not worthy, and one of the things we try and do is get our message across in a newsworthy way without distorting the message to make it, more newsworthy. This is something about what journalists will do when they're compiling a story. They often want to sort of provoke a response. A scientist might sort of build up evidence for their argument. A journalist might think, this is I've been contacted by journalists who've looked at some stats, maybe that antidepressant use in children has gone up X amount over the last 5 years, and they want to know, why is that? Is that because clinicians are overprescribing? Is it because depression's gone up? Is it because we are recognising it more? The numbers have stayed the same, but we're recognising it more. There's less stigma about approaching a clinician. So that's quite a complicated question. And I've been approached by journalists saying, what do you think the reason is? And then they're thinking, can we make a story out of this or not? So that did happen, for example, with this journalist who I sort of made contact with me via Twitter, Sarah Marsh. She's a good journalist at The Guardian. We also need to think, which media should we engage with? Sometimes you put out a story on, Reuters or something like that, or Sky News or something, and then it goes to a lot of different outlets. Keep taking the tabloids. I just put that slide on there. I think these figures are slightly out of date actually, but it just gives you an example about how much more widely read The Sun and the Daily Mail are compared with The Guardian, for example. So, if you want to get messages out there, you might feel a bit snobby about being quoted in The Sun, but actually, you'll get to a big readership. And online is massively bigger than print journalism, and as people will know, print journalism is very much on the decline, and online news is what it's all about. And those are some figures from the last year. So the Guardian print version, not many people look at it, but online, 42 million a month. Local media is quite a good way of sort of practicing your skills if you're doing this for the first time, and it's also a good way of getting stories picked up by within the press, and then maybe it gets picked up by the national press, and often they're more trusted, the local media, than sort of some of the national press. And one figure I read was that over 60% of adults, UK adults, read a local newspaper. So thinking also, what is your message? I think when I go and do an interview, I do try and think about what are my 3 main points that I want to make. So try and think in sound bites, and you can repeat the message during the course of the interview. Politicians are very good at this, but they're annoying when they don't answer the question. So you do want to sort of get your key message across, but you do also want to not sound like you're avoiding the question. So that's a kind of balance. I'll come on and say a little bit more about that. But you can repeat your point once or twice to get the message across. This is a colleague, Owen Bowen Jones, who's an expert in addiction, and actually I can plug his book, which came out in the last year or so, about sort of a parent's guide to talking to your teenagers about drugs. But he said, it's a good book, and he said people using legal highs are acting as guinea pigs for those making and distributing the drugs. And the Daily Mail liked that, and it was a good way of getting the message across. This is from the Sunday Times, something we did about depression in men, and those were some of our key messages. Depression is not a weakness of character. Famous people such as Winston Churchill have had depression. Don't bottle it up or take to the bottle. Obviously, people who are low sometimes try and drown their sorrows with alcohol, but alcohol, as you'll know, is a depressant and will end up making you more depressed. And seek help. So those were the sort of three key messages in that particular article that we tried to get across. I said I'd say something about language. You want to avoid psychiatric terminology, acronyms and jargon. So, as psychiatrists, we might know what positive symptoms mean, but your average person wouldn't know what positive symptoms are, and you don't really want to talk about, care program approach or suicidal ideation. You want to talk in sort of everyday language, really. So keep that in mind. So try and use patient-centered language. If you were, talking about one of your family members, would you prefer them to be referred to, and they had schizophrenia, would you prefer them to be referred to as a schizophrenic, not so great, or somebody with schizophrenia, more sort of user-friendly? Would you say the patient complains of? I mean, that's how we're taught at medical school, this patient complained of X, Y, Z. But actually, if you're talking in the media, you don't say this patient complained of. You might say, this patient said, or this patient reported. Refused or declined. Refused is more kind of pejorative, isn't it? Declined, they've got a choice. So how you use your language is important, and of course if the medium is the spoken word, that is particularly important. Try not to be stigmatizing, try and be objective. Try and illustrate your answers maybe with metaphors. Depression can feel like you're in a fog, that kind of thing. Using a thumbnail case history or anecdote, maybe talking about when a patient said to me once, or you need to be careful that patients are not identified, obviously, but you do want to engage the audience with these kind of personal stories, human stories if possible. In general, we're advised not to comment on individuals. It's very tempting to comment on people like Donald Trump sometimes, I must admit, but it's probably best not to. There's a whole debate amongst American psychiatrists, actually, which is quite an interesting one, about whether they have a responsibility to comment on his mental instability, to use that particular example. But by and large, we are advised that we can talk about psychiatric issues in general, but we shouldn't be talking about or giving opinions about individuals. And you get asked if a celebrity or an individual has disclosed certain mental health problems, you can get asked about that. Yeah.
The US psychiatrists, about 20 of them, didn't they?
They did, yeah.
Reported on his personality.
They did. They argued about, because the American.
That was hugely helpful, I think, for the public.
Yeah. I read that, and they were often psychoanalysts who did that. It was more the sort of psychoanalytic wing of the psychiatrist who really felt like he's got a sort of narcissistic personality disorder and very malignant, perverse traits, and they felt they had a public duty to sort of comment on how dangerous he is and how fragile his ego is and things like that. The American Psychiatric Association, which is a huge body, and their conferences have thousands and thousands of people attending them, they said to their psychiatrists, you can't comment. So the group that you're talking about were kind of rebelling against their professional body because they felt they had a kind of duty of responsibility. So I've read both sides of the argument, and I'm, in that particular case, kind of somewhat supportive of the people that felt like they wanted to comment on it rather than sort of be like an ostrich and sort of avoid it. But it's a bit of a hot debate. Try not to get stuck in traffic. I won't show you this actually, but I have got a clip. If you want to see it, you can. But basically, I did get stuck in traffic once. If we can easily show it, might be amusing. Have you? Can I just get that clip on? It's one of the clips. Basically, I'll just tell you the anecdote. It was on the Victoria Derbyshire programme. it's not that one. This was one of my first interviews I did a few years ago, and believe me, that one, we can just play that. So basically you'll see that there's 3 chairs and one of them is empty.
Mental health services. Well, Amy Sulman is 18. She's been using child adolescent mental health services since she was 11, and she says she often has to wait months for treatment. Shaun Duggan is the chief executive for the Centre for Mental Health, an independent charity. Good morning. Thank you both very much for joining us.
I've got the producer on the
Shaun,
phone.
tell us what your perspective is on this. Money should have been coming through. A lot of people saying it simply isn't.
Well, it's very disappointing, and it really should be coming through. The priority has got to be in mental health services. We've always known this for child and adolescent mental health care. 1 in 10 children suffer from a mental health problem, so that's 3 children in every class. And we were expecting and really delighted about some extra investment into the services. The fact that it's not coming through, the providers are telling us it's not coming through, is a cause for real concern.
Why do you think it's not coming through? I mean, it was promised.
Yeah, I think it's a number of reasons. I mean, we need to try and get hold of the facts here. But there are reports that the money is being used by clinical commissioning groups for other reasons, other pressing priorities. But as I repeat, there's no other better priority than child and adolescent mental health care. The other reason is that it's a very complicated setup. It's a very complicated arrangement, and this, for the money to be used efficiently and effectively, it really has to be, the services have to be designed really well. We know a lot about the evidence as to the interventions that work. They have to be targeted properly. They have to have the right professionals in place to do that. All that takes a bit of time, but that should have really been thought of at the very beginning, so we're not in this position now towards the end of the financial year suggesting that the money's not getting through. So that's not an excuse, but I think there are some probably legitimate delays, but let's be open and transparent about that, and let's not have a situation where we're thinking, well, maybe the money's been used for other reasons.
Joining us as well now, Dr Jon Goldin, consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist at Greater Ormond Street Hospital. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning.
Are you seeing any evidence of extra money filtering through?
Well, it's good news that more money has been promised, and we are seeing some evidence, but I don't think all the money is getting to the frontline services as it should be.
So what evidence have you seen?
Well, I know that there have been transformation plans over the last few months which have bid for money, and they've been successful in achieving that money. So some money is reaching frontline services.
So it's all promises at the moment still, is it? Or are you hearing about frontline services are actually getting the cash?
I'm hearing about some frontline services getting the cash, but I'm also hearing about some money not reaching the services, anecdotally. The money isn't ring-fenced for CAMHS. I mean, it's good news that more money has been promised. I think it's about 1.24 billion over the next 5 years. However, there is anecdotal evidence that not all that money is getting to the front line, because the NHS is in massive deficit at the moment. I think CCG...
That goes on, but we haven't really got time now. But it was just a learning experience. I mean, I normally get around on a motorbike, and I know how long it takes to get from A to B, and they offered a car, and I thought that'd be nice to get collected, but I just ended up sitting in traffic. It was not far from Great Ormond Street to the BBC, but I don't know if you know that underpass near UCL, UCL Hospital. We just sat in there for about half an hour not moving. Anyway, so yeah, try not to get stuck in traffic. Have your data and key messages to hand. Do prepare, but it's a conversation. So, you sometimes hear people on the radio reading something out, and if it's like thought for the day, that's okay. But, a lot of stuff doesn't sound good when it's just read out. So try not to do that. Think about what your 3 key points are. Try and relax. No one else will manage your anxiety. Obviously, I was a bit like a duck there, paddling away underwater, trying to appear calm. I was quite stressed when I arrived, but you do your best to try and appear calm. Focus on the person in front of you. So I did something on the BBC News, and the guy actually was very helpful. One of the technicians said to me, there are going to be cameras moving around the studio with nobody holding them, so just be aware of that, because this was a kind of a relatively new thing to me, and it was really nice that he told me that. They've got these automated cameras, and it was a little bit weird to sort of see them out of the corner of your eye, but the fact that that particular technician took the trouble to tell me that, I appreciated it, because by and large, it's up to you to manage anxiety, but try and focus on the person in front of you, as I say, not all the peripherals. Something about the interview itself, I would quite like to play this, because I was having a slightly out-of-body experience back in January 2016 when I was being interviewed by John Humphrey, and it was my first interview on the Today programme, and we were talking about child sexual abuse. And, well, just have a listen, and there's a particular question that I really was not expecting.
Helping a child with mental health problems is a highly skilled branch of medicine. Get it wrong, and the child can be damaged for life, which is why the result of a new survey by the NSPC is so worrying. It's found that almost all the experts who work with children who have been sexually assaulted believe there are not enough mental health services in the country. Well, I'm joined by Dr Jon Goldin, Royal College of Psychiatrists, and a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist himself. Dr Goldin, what is the problem? How many children who are sexually assaulted do end up with serious mental health problems?
I think there's a seriously part of the issue that it's reported more, but what we need to do now that we're more aware of this situation of young people being sexually abused is for the services to meet that need more fully.
Are we absolutely certain that the sort of therapies that we've heard talked about do work? I mean, can it be the case that people, and this might apply to children as well, perhaps this is a question, not an assertion, can it be the case that it's better for them to bury the memory? Is it ever better to bury a memory?
I don't think it is better for them to bury the memory, and clinicians would not agree with that as a concept, really. I think it's very important that children have the opportunity to have a therapeutic relationship, to build up a sense of trust and security with a suitably trained, experienced therapist who can help them work through the trauma of being sexually abused. Studies have shown very clearly links between child sexual abuse and longer-term adult mental health problems.
In what sense? How might that manifest itself?
It might manifest itself in children becoming depressed, self-harm, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, a significant impact on their daily functioning. And then, of course, as these children grow up and become adults and parents themselves, the cycle of deprivation and abuse and difficulties can be perpetuated. So it's crucial to intervene young to help these children get the help that they need in order that their longer-term problems are prevented.
Intervene with what sort of therapy?
Well, there are various sorts of therapy that occur. Basic psychoeducation is very important.
Meaning?
Well, children get a very distorted sense of sexuality and relationships if they've been sexually abused. So helping them understand what is normal, what is not normal, what is healthy sexuality, what is abnormal sexuality. So that's the basics of psychoeducation. But there are other forms of therapy such as trauma-focused CBT, narrative exposure therapy. Narrative exposure therapy involves helping the young person slowly, bit by bit, talk about their experience in a safe place, always returning to kind of sense of safety, but giving them time to really work through their difficulties.
Dr Goldin, thank you very much indeed.
17 minutes past 7 later today.
Okay, how do we get rid of that? Sorry. It's okay. So yeah, I mean, one of the points I was making there is you don't know what they're going to ask you, and I really wasn't expecting that particular question about burying it, so you probably heard I was sort of thinking on my feet a little bit, and you just have to expect that. It would be great if you went into an interview and they gave you a list of questions before you go in there, but that really doesn't happen. So you need to sort of think about the topic carefully in advance. I had done some research, before, but also the other thing is you don't often get much notice, so you might only have a couple of hours notice. But I have a colleague who has a particular interest in child sexual abuse that I spoke to before I did this interview, so that was helpful. And obviously I know a reasonable amount about it as well, but I had a colleague who had a particular expertise, and so I picked her brain before I did that interview. So do a bit of background research. Be honest, be engaging. Don't hide behind medical jargon. You want to try and get the listener or the viewer's trust, obviously. You don't want to speak beyond your area of expertise. Some of you might have heard, this is not really a media example, it's a court example, but Professor Sir Roy Meadow from several years ago, he was a real senior expert in fabricated induced illness, a form of child abuse. And he was talking about cot deaths, and he was saying, the risk of one baby dying is, I can't remember the exact figure, but for argument's sake, say it's 1 in a million, and the risk of 2 babies dying in the same family is 1 million times 1 million, so 1 in a billion kind of chance. But he got his statistics wrong, because obviously if you have 1 baby dying, that's going to increase the risk of a second baby for various sort of statistical reasons. So he did speak beyond his area of expertise, and he really got into trouble for that in quite a major way. So he was a major expert in one area, but he was not an expert in stats, and he made a mistake. And it went to the Court of Appeal, and I won't tell the whole story now, but you need to stick to your area of expertise. Don't be afraid of stating that you don't know if you don't know. Don't kind of bullshit, and it's okay to say you don't know sometimes. And try and speak from the heart as well. That if it's a national scandal and you feel it is, say it. If it's deeply upsetting and you mean that, you could say that. I sometimes say, in a humane society, we should be, investing in our children. What kind of society do we want to build together? And I feel that quite passionately, and I'm happy to sort of say that kind of thing. Don't say things that you don't believe in. I think it's acceptable to play for time sometimes, to give yourself time to think. You might say something like, I think that's a very important question. There are different aspects to this issue, and that might be a way of sort of slightly playing for time. And in terms of answering the question, as I was saying earlier, politicians are often experts at not answering the question. I think it's important to answer the question, but sometimes you can sort of spike the question, I think is the jargon. You answer the question briefly and then you move to your key message that you actually want to do. And there's a kind of balance between getting your key messages across and answering the question. And also interviewers John Humphrey was, he wasn't too bad with me really. He didn't grill me like a sort of, he would have grilled a cabinet minister or something. So I think their style is sometimes different depending on who they're talking to. You want to kind of retain control, but you don't want to be dominating. So you might shape the interview by these kind of phrases, before I answer that, or, this leads us on to another equally important issue. You can sort of steer it as a kind of journey in the direction that you want it to go in to some extent. And you can also feel able to correct things that are presented to you. So that was an example of that I've just played. As I said, I had to think on my feet. I really wasn't expecting that one, but I kind of said, no, clinicians would not agree with that concept. And I could have got into, Freud's return of the repressed and, theoretical reasons why burying memories is not a helpful idea, but that gets back to the question of knowing your audience. The audience doesn't want to hear about Freud and return of the repressed and that kind of thing, so you just have to try and use everyday language. From my clinical experience, that's not the case, something like that. We got into a little bit of a ding-dong with the Royal College of Paediatrics about the impact of social media on mental health. So the Royal College of Paediatrics has an expert who is very much downplaying any impact on mental health at all, saying there's no evidence for it, it's not harmful at all. And we as clinicians in child and adolescent psychiatrists see the impact on a daily basis of young people, viewing images of self-harm and eating disorders online and so on. So we focus on our clinical experience. We don't argue with them about statistics and the research. I think the research has to catch up with our clinical experience to some extent. So you can say things like, from my clinical experience, that isn't the case, or we do see patients who are detrimentally influenced by this kind of thing. Try and include some positives. I'm going to finish in a minute, but I think this is really important because there's a lot of mental health staff bashing and things like that, and I think trying to say that how dedicated and compassionate people are. Despite the challenges, we are making some progress. You don't only want to sort of give bad news stories, otherwise people sort of stop listening. So this is a step in the right direction. With continued investment, I've got no doubt that things will improve over time, these kind of things. I'm running a little bit out of time, but you might want to just think about a single word to emphasize, particularly your message. It's encouraging or it's unacceptable, etc. You might try and come across in some of these different ways. Calm, thoughtful, knowledgeable, hopefully. You need to think about your body language as well on TV, hand gestures, get feedback. One of the media officers gave me feedback, I didn't smile enough. I said, well, I'm talking about deliberate self-harm, it's not really something to smile about. But actually when you're on TV, if you can find a little connection with the interviewer that might have a tiny bit of humour in it, that's sometimes helpful just to make you look kind of more human. But your facial expressions, your speed, I tend to speak quite quickly. I know that partly because I've got limited time and maybe got a lot to say. I did say something about Twitter. I will finish on this actually. I think it's a good way of accessing and sharing information. I think it's very easy to get into kind of polarised debates, and there's some unpleasant stuff out there. And Jess Phillips is an MP who seems to be there seem to be some men debating on Twitter about whether or not they would rape her. This is absolutely dreadful stuff, and this is kind of going on a day-to-day basis. And that's just one example from the last few days. So there's some horrible stuff going on. and how much you engage with that is up to you. You know, you can get into a real argument with some of these people who are really, you know, probably insecure, inadequate people who feel with a Twitter account they can, you know, an anonymised Twitter account, they can get away with sort of spewing this awful stuff. I tend to ignore that kind of thing, to be honest. I tend to maybe support someone who is, you know, give them a like when they're saying, you know, this is how I'm addressing it. But, you know, do you really want to get into a polarised debate with someone that is really just out there to you know, attack psychiatrists, attack women, attack, you know, whatever is in their target? And I personally try not to get into that kind of polarised debate wherever possible. You need to be diplomatic, you need to consider your role, you're representing your organisation, you're representing your profession. You can become a bit of an influencer over time if you're, you know, putting stuff out there that people are interested in, and you need to think about, you know, it's a great way of actually accessing information as well as sharing information. So I used to think Twitter was for twits, you know, people used to say that a few years ago, and I have to say I've been somewhat converted and find it pretty useful. But you also need to be careful, it can be time consuming. I try and avoid spending, you know, more than about 10 minutes a day on it. Yeah.
Thank you for a really good presentation.
Yeah, I am literally about to finish
right,
there. Yeah,
sorry.
yeah, no, it's all right. We can finish there. I was going to say something about the GMC guidance, but...
No, I was just going to ask you, you were really talking about reacting to whatever is in the media and
Yeah.
any questions. But as an influencer, you know, say in terms of really topical issues like the NACOA issue, which, you know, John Ashworth and Liam Byrne and all of that were out recently, and the NACOA marathon, all of that. I just, I suppose in my own country, I'd love to see psychiatry coming out much more in a proactive way to talk about what they see in the clinic rooms in terms of, say, the impact of parental substance misuse on adults, as you do about the sexual abuse. I thought that interview was excellent, but I'd love to see more of that in other topic areas, such as, you know, fetal alcohol spectrum disorders or parental substance misuse. So much more of that would really engage the population, rather than just all the time reacting to what's in the media. So
Yeah.
that's just a
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, we do try and influence what is out there. And as far as parental substance abuse goes, I mean, you probably know the Labour health spokesman, what's his name? John Ashworth.
Yes.
Yeah, so his father was an alcoholic,
Yes.
and he's put quite a lot out there on social media. And whenever he ran the marathon for children of parents with alcohol problems, so he's someone, and then you can sort of piggyback on that a little bit where possible. So yeah, you need to keep an eye out for what is out there, and you can. I agree with you. You can try and influence the media, but it's a huge juggernaut, and they're going to have their topics that they're interested in, and some more than others. And child mental health, for better or worse, has been a very popular topic the last 2 or 3 years, which we're pleased about. And I know that means that, you know, other topics sometimes get less airtime. So one tries to find a balance and get other messages maybe that are less popular out there when one can as well.
Thank you.
Any other questions before we finish, or comments? Yeah.
I have a colleague of mine who used to be very famous. Sometimes you can listen for 2-3 minutes.
Can you hear at the back? No. Have you got a mic? Or?
Yeah.
Maybe just speak loudly so they can hear as well. Yeah. Yeah.
This gentleman used to be very famous, like very hot stuff in the media. But when I listen to his video or YouTube, I find him spending 2-3 minutes sometimes saying nothing.
Right.
He's a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
He keeps saying anything, but people are very impressed. And I don't know how did he got this influence on the TV to the degree that people even listen to him while he's I don't want to say talking rubbish, but he's talking meaningless. There is no meaning for what he's saying for 2-3 minutes, and still he became very popular. How does this happen?
I don't know the answer to that. I obviously don't know who you're referring to, but I mean, I noticed, as I said earlier, that one gets asked to do things again when one has a particular strong viewpoint of something. That's what the media kind of like. So I don't know this individual that you're talking about, but maybe they like something about his message, that he's quite definite about things, or if you're too nuanced or whatever, maybe they, as I said about eating disorders, they kind of stopped asking me after a while, because that wasn't a message that they really wanted to print, that the cause of eating disorders is complex and multifactorial and so on. So but I guess it could also be who you know, and maybe he's mates with producers, or sometimes I went to a talk yesterday by a family lawyer, and he said we're in a different kind of bubble to all you psychiatrists and things, and if we just knew one name we would be so happy, and then we could liaise with them. So you're in your different bubbles, so it may be that there's a media bubble, and then he's somehow got connected with them, and then they keep asking him. I don't know, though, is the honest answer. I think if you're good at it, you tend to get asked more, and if you're not so good at it, you tend to get asked less. So I think that might be an exception, hopefully. All right, we should probably finish, shouldn't we? Okay, thank you all very much for coming. Appreciate it.